Okay, we are ready to talk about the events, I'll say some of the events that occurred during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. We are actually going to need to take several days on him because um, I want you to have a good understanding of World War One, and because he's such an active and what we're going to call progressive president, there's lots of other things happening too. It's not just World War One because we don't even get into World War One until 1917. It starts in Europe in 1914, but we don't get involved for many years. So I needed to tell you some of the other things that are going on so you have a good view of his presidency and what's happening in the United States, and then we'll get to the war. So we're going to be a few days on Wilson because I want to give you a good opportunity to understand World War One and give us a chance to explore that. Okay, so this is one of Wilson's campaign posters, and this is his periodic card, like I showed you from that website, and then his person from the ourwhitehouse.org site. Okay, I put these are images used even now to represent the Democratic and the Republican Party. The Republican Party is illustrated with an elephant, and the Democratic Party is illustrated with a donkey. They had started before this. This was not the first time. There was a political cartoonist named Nash who drew a political cartoon, and he had the Democratic Party represented by a donkey that was dressed up in sheep's clothing and scaring other animals, and one of them was a big elephant, and on the big elephant it said Republican Party. Well, since he did that, it kind of took off, and so since then they have been used to illustrate the parties. So I wanted to put that image there so that you could understand what they meant, because you're going to see this in media and other places, and I want you to know which is which. So D and D helps. Democratic donkey, that helps me, and then the Republican is the elephant. Okay, Wilson is a leader in the progressive movement. If we think of progressive presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson are really in your progressives. Roosevelt is really progressive, and the idea of progressive is wanting positive change, looking for where things are being done wrong and wanting to change it. So that's progressive. Progress means to move forward, to make a change. We don't see Wilson just sitting back and sitting on his hands and wanting things to stay the same. We see him wanting it to change for the better. And a lot of his program was called New Freedom. New freedom. He wanted new freedom for the American people. He wanted progress. So here's in his first 2 years, he passed more legislative things, so like bills and laws, than any of the previous 11 years, which includes Theodore Roosevelt. So we think of Theodore Roosevelt as being this kind of hyperactive, getting lots of things done, and he was definitely in personality more hyperactive than Wilson. But as far as being progressive and getting things accomplished, Wilson was even more progressive than Theodore Roosevelt, even though he seems very quiet and serious, which is kind of interesting to compare the two personalities. So during his leadership, I have always wondered, okay, so where was the change? Because for a long time, remember, the Democrats were the party of the South during Civil War, and the Republicans were the party of the North, so they seem like the ones that want positive change. Well, if you look in society now, the Democrats are the ones that are changing more things, and the Republicans are what we would call conservative, trying to keep rights in place, trying to protect important rights and keep them from changing too much. So this is when it happened. He is the one that started changing the Democratic Party into the Progressive Party, and then the Republicans became the Conservative Party. So this is where it switched, and I didn't realize that till just now. So I'm happy about learning new things. So in his first 2 years, he passed some of the most progressive laws. The first income tax. Now you're about to stop me, and you're going to say, wait a minute. Taft did that. Yes, it was approved, but remember I told you something very important. I said that it got passed that they could have an income tax, but he did not institute it yet. He didn't start it. He just got it clear to where it's constitutional, but he didn't actually enact it. Wilson does. He enacts the income tax. And why is this progressive? This is progressive because the people who didn't make very much, who made a certain amount of money, because this is income based on what your job and what you make, they paid the government a certain percent, like I think it was 1% of what they made. But if you made above a certain amount, you paid 6% or more. So you actually paid the government more. And he was trying to keep the more wealthy in check, and that they were going to support the government more. He lowered tariffs. So we've talked about this idea of tariffs, of taxes on goods coming from other countries. And this has been a battle we've seen through lots of administrations. And he actually lowered the tariff rates to lower that they have been since the Civil War. I think it went down like something like 20%. He lowered it extremely. Then he reorganized the banking system. He didn't want, there was a lot of crisis a few years ago in some banking things, and people were panicking over losing their money. And so he reorganized the banking system and created the Federal Reserve Act and put the Federal Reserve, which is a government organization, in charge of the money supply, so that they could control interest rates, and they could control the money going in and out, so that they could try to decrease the ability of having a depression. So he gave that power back to the government. He tried to control unfair business activities. So again, he's just like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, trying to break up these trusts and trying to keep these super mega rich businesses from taking over everything and controlling everything. So he is on top of that also. Again, remember, you can pause me if you're not as fast as I am. Okay, here's some more. We have the Federal Farm Act that gave money to help struggling farmers. So sent money out to these farmers in the West that were having trouble. Passed laws banning articles made by child labor to be sold to other states. Now, I saw in my research, it was talking about that he passed some labor laws. And I was like, wait a minute, I know we've talked about that before. Here's the thing, and maybe I wasn't clear because I didn't understand it. I told you way back in, I think it was Arthur's presidency in the 1880s, that there were passing some laws for child labor. Yes, they did, and they were trying to make it better, but they did not end it. And there were still, by 1911, there was like 2 million children working in these very unsafe factories. Some were working in mines. They were working in unsafe conditions and for long periods of time, and they weren't allowed to go to school like some of the other children. There were public schools at this point, and some children weren't able to go because they were working in factories. This is a picture of some little boys standing on this machine and working this machine. So Wilson tries to pass some stricter laws to help reduce child labor. He can't completely get rid of it yet. None of those bills pass in the House. He tried, and it wouldn't pass. They did pass some laws that said that you could not sell materials that were made by child labor to another state. Okay, interstate commerce is what that's called. And they passed that law, and then 2 years later, the Supreme Court struck it down and said that it was unconstitutional. So what they said was, no, we can't have that law anymore. It's okay. You can sell that. They said that that was not a constitutional law and got rid of it. So there's lots of people trying to work on behalf of these kids and trying to get those laws changed. But I want you to know that during this time period we're talking about, early 1900s, there are still children that are working full days, and it doesn't really get changed very much until the Depression, about 1930. And then there's some more things passed that really start to put a cap on the age limit, or put a minimum age limit on when you can work. Okay, he also reduced the workday. I think this was mainly for trained employees, but he reduced it to 8 hours. He created the National Park Service. And you may say, well, wait a minute, wasn't that Theodore Roosevelt? And Theodore Roosevelt put aside some land, and I explained this in the morning video, but he put aside some land as belonging to the government, but he did not have a National Park Service, and that was established in 1916. And then these come up a little bit later, even after the war, but I wanted to go ahead and put them here because then we're going to put our whole attention on what's going on in the war. The 18th Amendment is passed in 1918, beginning Prohibition. Prohibition was, remember, the banning of the making and selling of alcohol. So you cannot make and sell alcohol. So bars shut down, saloons shut down. You can't distribute that. Okay, sounds great, right? Sounds like, especially when you think that alcohol could be used by people to use up a lot of the money that should go to their families, or that it might cause their personalities to change in a way. But think about what happens. Do people just say, okay, and everybody stops? What do you think happens? If I say, you can't do this, if the government says, this is not legal, what do? They do it anyway, and it becomes illegal. And then lots of the wrong people get very, very rich. It creates lots and lots of violence. And this is going to lead to the gang era. When you think about mobsters in their suits and their hats, smoking their cigars, that's the 1920s. And that's all because of Prohibition. So kind of interesting to see all of the different effects of it. 19th Amendment, 1920, women are finally given the right to vote. And this is cool because when is this coming? 1920, this comes, and this is the 100th anniversary. This year is the 100th anniversary of it. So that's cool. And this is called suffrage. The ability to vote is suffrage. So when does this come? After World War I. What have women been doing in World War I? Working, and working hard. A lot of the men went over to be soldiers, and what did the women do? They took their places in the factories. They built machines. They built planes. They did jobs that they built cars. They did the jobs that their husbands were doing. And so what did they do? They proved themselves to be valuable. And then, so after World War I, they basically couldn't say no. They had proved to the world that they had the right to vote just as much as anybody else. Okay, now something going on at the same time is there's problems with Mexico. There is a Mexican Revolution, and for a while, Wilson takes the stand of watchful waiting, which means I'm not going to do anything, but it also waiting gives you this idea that he may eventually do something. So he's kind of pulling back. He's not saying he's not going to do anything, but he's saying he's watching and he's waiting to try to see if we need to intervene. And then in the meantime, he goes to Mobile, Alabama, and he makes a speech. And in his speech, he declares the Mobile Doctrine, which says that the United States will never take territory by conquest again. Wow, go Wilson. We've done this so many times, haven't we? We've just gone in, taken over, and taken land that we wanted. And Wilson declares that we're not going to do that again. He's not getting involved in Mexico just so that he can take their land. Okay? But in the meantime, sailors go down to Mexico. They're arrested. I've heard different things, but most likely there wasn't any really good reason why they were arrested. Wilson demanded an apology and the expression of like a 21 gun salute from their government. You need to give us an apology. And the government said, no. They released the sailors, but they refused to apologize by shooting their cannons off. So he sent the Marines in. Well, when the Marines get in there, the leader that they were having this argument with was taken over by the revolution. He was overthrown by this, I call it his replacement, but he's really a revolutionary. And he's this dangerous guy who comes in and throws the previous president out. We have to be really thankful that we don't have to worry about this in our country. There are lots of countries, even now, that have revolutions where their leaders are just overthrown and kicked out. And this big army comes and invades their, like our White House, and says, nope, we're in charge now, and kicks that one out. That's never happened to us. So the leader, this revolutionary leader, was named Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa comes in, kicks out the previous guy, and then leads armies in to attack New Mexico. So now the president's like, oh my goodness. So he sends the military to capture him. I say chase him because that's what they wind up doing. He sends the military to stop him, and then he runs away. He runs back into Mexico. Without permission, our military follows him into Mexico and chases him for like a year. They never catch him, and so we retreat. We're like, fine. By that point, we have other things to worry about, which is a world war. So we can't find him. We're like, we're done messing with this, and we go back and deal with more pressing things at the moment. Kind of interesting how things seem a little crazy, right? Okay, here's some things that are going on in culture. Jack Johnson, the first black world heavyweight boxing champion. And a lot of people did not like the idea that this black man was beating, he was winning against white boxers. But can you imagine how the African American community felt? How proud they must have been of this boxer and how important even his job is. You think, well, he was just a boxer. That is really important for a people. It gives them hope. It gives them someone to look up to, and encourages others. Modern art. I don't know if you've ever heard of or seen some Picasso art. Matisse is another artist that's very similar to this, and they have a style called Cubism. And Cubism is not just these smooth, beautiful lines that had been characteristic of art. It takes things and like blocks them off and makes them real pointy and squares and just kind of mixes them up. And it treats people as objects instead of giving them kind of different characteristics. So we have Cubism coming to play, and Picasso's art often will have the noses in weird places and the eyes kind of not side by side. An eye may be here and an eye may be here. It's kind of an unusual art, but that is in the early 1900s. Then we have already talked about the Model T, I know, and we already have the Model T. However, during this time, Henry Ford creates the assembly line, which makes the creation of the Model T faster and cheaper, because before one person worked on one car and that was a lot of labor, so your price goes up. When I can put it on an assembly line and all I do is screw in this bolt and pass it, and they screw that in and they screw that in, then that can make it faster. And then when it's faster and it doesn't require as many workers, then I can sell the car cheaper. And one of his famous quotes is that you can have the Model T in any color you want, as long, or yeah, in any of your favorite colors, as long as your favorite color is black. And they didn't paint it in any other color. They only painted it in black, and that saved on cost too, because you're not paying for something special. They bought one color of paint, and that's what they painted them all. Charlie Chaplin. I hope you've heard his name. I don't know if you've seen pictures like this kind of shuffling guy. This is still silent films, but there are movies, full-length movies coming out, and movie people who are becoming movie stars. And Charlie Chaplin is one of those. And he had this short little black mustache and this round bowler hat, and he just kind of shuffled around. And he was a comedian. It was all slapstick comedy and just comedy in his facial expressions and the way that he moved. But again, no talking. This is still silent pictures. We don't have sound pictures yet. Sound movies. Okay, that's what's going on. Tomorrow we're going to start talking about World War I. I did, in the email that I sent to you and your parents, you have 2 links in there to the 2 different homes on Woodrow Wilson. His home that he moved to after his presidency and his boyhood home in Staunton. And the one in Staunton, Virginia has more information because that's also the presidential library. So that might give you some cool things to go and explore. In the for the comments below, let's see. I forgot about this. So let me go back here. I'm going to go back here for just a second. Okay. Which one, pick one thing here on this screen to give me a sentence about in your comments. So it can be whether you thought that this was good because, don't just say this is good. Tell me why it's good. Tell me why you think maybe something could be bad. It can be a question about any of these, but give me a sentence or a question or something about anything from this slide. Okay, I'll be reading them.